What is up, everyone? Today we're going to be talking about while loops in Python. So what exactly is a while loop and how does it differ from for loops, in which we talked about in the last video? So take this scenario. Let's say you're on the track team and your track coach says, hey guys, I want you all to run 20 laps. So how would you actually do this using a for loop, right? Take a minute and pause the video and try and figure that out. So basically what you would be doing is you would say for and then a variable, so lap, I would say in range 20. I want to actually print the lap number, and I want to actually print that I actually ran the lap, right? I am running a lap, running another lap, right? So when you run this, it's going to execute 20 times, starting from 0, so it's going to end at 19, right? Because it starts from 0, and so it's going to execute 20 times, right? As expected. So you might say, well, okay, well, how does a while loop actually compare to this? Well, you can actually do the exact same thing we did here with a while loop. You can say counter is equal to 0, and then I'm going to say while counter is less than 20, print counter, right? And so when you run this, basically what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, instead of actually having a variable automatically or by default be set to 0 to start off, with a while loop you actually have to define this variable beforehand, right? And then you would say, while the counter is less than 20, I want you to actually print the value of counter, right? So when you run this, what actually happens is it actually continues to loop indefinitely, right? So what's happening is because we're not actually increasing counter in each iteration. Well, you might say, well, in this loop, you're not actually doing that either. Well, we're not manually doing that, but again, in for loops, automatically Python will increment this or increase this by 1 by default, right? But in a while loop, you actually have to manually increase it by 1 or whatever value you want. So when you run this, now it actually executes 20 times starting from 0, right? So these are two loops. So what happens here is we might say, well, why is that? Why are we even using a while loop? It looks like it's just more complicated and just longer than this when this is doing the exact same thing. Well, that's true. And why is that? Well, because while loops aren't really supposed to be used for this case. They can be used, but they weren't really invented, I guess, for this specific use case. What they were actually intended to be used for is when you don't know how many times you're going to be executing the loop. So in this example, right, our coach told us, hey, I want you to run 20 laps. So I know beforehand, I've actually defined how many laps I actually want to run because I know this starts from 0 and this is going to actually terminate once the lap is actually 20, right? So I know how many laps or I know how many times this block of code is actually going to execute. And that's exactly when I should be using a for loop. But say I didn't know how many times I actually wanted or I'm actually going to execute a loop, then I should be using a while loop. Well, you might be confused by this, so let's actually look at another example in a similar situation. Let's say your track coach says, okay guys, I'm going to be nicer today, or actually he's not going to be nicer, he's going to be crazier, but he's going to say, I want you guys to run until one of you passes out, right? So that's definitely not nicer. That's like crazy. So he's saying, I want you to keep running laps until one of you passes out. So how many laps am I going to run? Can I use a for loop for this? Well, I can't because I can't actually set a number in the range. I don't know how many laps I'm going to run. I don't know when somebody's going to decide to pass out. I don't know that. So that's when you should be using a while loop, right? So let's actually do this using a while loop. So I'm going to erase this just so you guys finally, I think you guys understand how a for loop is being used in this case. And so with a while loop in this case, let's actually define another variable called passed out. Set that to be false. So this is a Boolean. Oops. And so I'm actually going to change this while loop and say while passed out equals false. So what is it saying? Well, it's saying while passed out is equal to false, I'm going to actually do what? I'm actually going to print I am running another lap, right? So let's say that basically in each iteration you're going to be running a lap, right? So you're going to keep running a lap until or as long as nobody has passed out yet, right? And then when somebody passes out, you're going to stop running a lap, running any more laps, right? So when you actually run this, notice what happens. Again, you're going to keep running for an infinite number of laps, right? So I'm actually trying to, so you ran 766 laps before I managed to stop you. So basically, this is because, why is this happening? Well, because we're not actually checking if somebody passed out. All we're saying is saying, okay, as long as nobody's passed out, I'm going to actually keep running and increasing counter. But counter is not even related to this condition. Counter is just the number of laps you ran, right? So what's going to happen here is we actually have to add a check to see if somebody passed out or not. And since this is a very, imaginary situation, which like we can't really check if somebody actually passes out in this case, I'm going to be using a random number for simplicity to check if somebody passed out, like just to simulate the idea of somebody passing out. So I'm actually going to import a package called random. If you don't know what this is, it's totally fine. This is not important for you to understand how while loops work. Just understand that what I'm doing here is I'm actually going to generate a random number inside of the range from 0 to 25. So a number between 0 and 25, or starting at 0 and ending at 25, I'm actually going to get a number, and I'm going to check if that number is equal to, this can be any number. I'm just making anything, right? So let's say 10, right? Or let's say 15, right? It doesn't really matter, right? So I'm saying if the random number generated here, so in each loop iteration, a random number is going to be generated. So I'm saying if this random number is actually equal to 15, so remember 15 is just a random number I chose. It's not really a specific value. It could be 10, 5, whatever, right? As long as it's in the range, right? So I'm saying if this is the case, then let's say somebody passed out. Let's assume that if this happened, somebody passed out, right? So somebody passed out. And then I'm going to print, or actually no, I'm just going to do what, this is very important, right? This is necessary for the loop to actually execute at one point. I'm going to set the value of passed out to be what? To be true, because somebody finally passed out, right? So if you're still confused about this, this is just to simulate the idea of somebody passing out, right? In a real application, a real program, you're going to have an actual condition here and an actual, test or logic that you're actually going to check if somebody or something will cause this condition or this variable to change, right? But in this case, since, this is an imaginary situation, we're just going to assume that if a random number generated is equal to this random number that we chose, then somebody passed out, right? It's just to simulate, since we don't actually know how many laps we're going to run. So when we actually run this, notice what happens. For the first time, you actually run 15 laps because we're starting at 0. So let's actually change this because it makes more sense to start, the first lap is actually at 1. So when you run this a second time, you actually run 18 laps, right? So every time it's actually changing. Well, here you got lucky, right? You only ran 2 laps before somebody passed out. Well, you got lucky. The other person is not lucky. So hopefully they're okay. But the idea is that you're going to keep running until somebody finally passes out. Until finally somebody passes out. And when somebody passes out, you're going to set that passed out value to be true. And then what's going to happen is after you finish running this lap, you're going to go up here into the condition and test it. Has somebody still not passed out yet? That's basically what you're checking here. And you're going to say, well, no, actually, I checked and somebody actually passed out because the passed out value is equal to true. And so since this is going to be, since passed out is going to be equal to true, then this condition is going to be false, right? So what's going to happen is you're not going to run any more laps. You're done, right? So that's kind of the idea of how a while loop should be used, right? It's when you don't know how many loops or executions you're actually going to perform. So let's take another example. Let's say your coach says, well, actually today, guys, I want you to keep running until somebody passes out or until you've ran, 10 laps, right? Because we're starting at 1, so it's going to run 10 laps. So what's going to happen here. So notice what happens is I actually run 10 laps. So let's say I print the counter, which is 10, and I say, okay, I'm going to check for a random number, and then I'm actually going to go back here and say, well, pass out is equal to false, and counter is less than 11. Well, it's not, right? Because I increased counter, which was 10 by 1, so now counter is equal to 11. So this is false, right? This is false because this is false, right? But at the same time, this could also be false because let's say in this very rare case, somebody passed out on the 10th lap and it's your 10th lap. So both this and this will be false, making this whole thing false. But remember, for this and, right, for this condition to be false, only at least one of them has to be false, right? So you know that automatically after you finish running 10 laps, 100%, you're not going to run anymore, right? Right. So that's how while loops work, guys. And again, you can actually have nested while loops. You can have a for loop here, a while loop here. You can have nested loops. So it's kind of like how for loops work. You can have multiple loops inside each other. So thanks for watching, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned.